We are about as the human race, 90 seconds to midnight on the doomsday clock, which predicts the potentiality of a catastrophic, humanity ending nuclear war. And of course, the epicenter of this possible threat that is lurching ever so close to reality exists in Ukraine, not because of Ukraine proper, but because the Kiev regime, along with its NATO allies, those who are supplying Ukraine, who are making this conflict possible, continue to climb the escalation ladder in ways which is provoking and are provoking Russia into making preparations for the unthinkable. And of course, we've seen how these escalations have already borne fruit from the fact that the United States and NATO have okayed and greenlit long range missiles and other weapons supplied by the West to be used on Russian territory, leading to prominent figures in the Kremlin, including Putin himself, to say that if these weapons are used on Russian territory, that NATO installations in the NATO countries from which they have been released from, if those weapons, like F-16s, for example, come from a NATO country, any NATO country, like the Netherlands, for example, which is considering or is going to supply in July these F-16s, if they leave from the Netherlands and go and strike Russian territory, well, the Netherlands is a target of Russia now. That is just logical. That is actually the laws of war. But now Russia is willing to make this very clear because the threat of nuclear war is very real. And Russia is, for all of its attempts to prevent such a thing from occurring, fed up. It has had enough. And that is why we are entering this period of absolute potential for nuclear devastation like we haven't seen. And it's not Russia's fault. It is NATO's, it is the United States. And you better believe that if there is going to be a force that uses nuclear weapons, it's going to be the US and NATO. This is all about provocation and laying the scene. A lot of people like to talk about false flags, but really all of US and NATO foreign policy is one big false flag when it comes to provoking the rising powers to the east, Russia and China, those who they see as peer competitors, who they simply cannot outcompete. But here is another example. So if you read Russian media, you can get the sense that Russia is preparing for this conflict, a nuclear war, and they're doing so by sending very strong messages. I've shown you how prominent Russian think tanks are talking about potentially test launching a nuclear or strategic nuclear weapon, a bomb, to show that a mushroom cloud could very much well occur because of NATO's actions. Well, here's another piece, this time published in RT, talking about how Russia can prevent World War III through leveraging nuclear weapons. It says for 80 years, the atom bomb prevented a repeat of the horrors of the 1940s, and Russia needs to leverage it again to stop American aggression. So we're talking about deterrence here. And while we certainly do not want to see a Hiroshima and a Nagasaki repeat, we also have to be very aware that it was the fact that these nuclear weapons were used, of course, with devastating human costs, that they weren't used again, because that is why there was an arms race and a buildup. It was the United States wanted to show the world that it could end humanity, and that's why you needed to essentially bow down to its diktats. And it was the Soviet Union and it was China in the 60s. China finally was able to build its own nuclear weapon. The DPRK, North Korea, we know about its nuclear capabilities. It is these countries that have built up a nuclear capacity, not because they want to use them for the same purposes, but because they want to prevent their Hiroshima and Nagasaki happening to them. And of course, we know the infamous example of Muammar Gaddafi in Libya essentially rejecting building nuclear weapons and building nuclear deterrence. And we saw what happened to Gaddafi. And Kim Jong-un himself has said very publicly that it is these countries that weren't able to build up a nuclear capacity that are now finished. They have been regime changed by the US empire. So here's the article. It says nuclear deterrence is not a myth. It kept the world safe during the Cold War. Deterrence is a psychological concept. You have to convince a nuclear armed adversary that it will not achieve its objectives by attacking you, and that if it goes to war, its own annihilation is assured. The mutual deterrence between the USSR and the US during their confrontation was reinforced by the reality of mutually assured destruction in the event of a nuclear exchange of massive nuclear strikes. Incidentally, the abbreviation for mutually assured destruction is MAD, and that's very apt. There are several reasons for mythologizing nuclear deterrence. Since the end of the Cold War, there's been widespread belief that every conceivable reason for nuclear war has disappeared. A new era of globalization, with its emphasis on economic cooperation, has dawned. For the first time in history, the hegemony of a single power, the US, has been established globally, and nuclear weapons remain in the arsenals of the great powers, though fewer than at the height of the confrontation, but the fear of their use has faded. More dangerously, a new generation of politicians has come to the fore, unburdened either by the memory of decades of confrontation or by a sense of responsibility. And this is exactly right. We see this so clearly in how the United States and how NATO is behaving right now. They do not have any sense of responsibility for the consequences of their actions and are relying on Russia and China, which I'll show you later, to not engage in nuclear war, because everything that they're doing leads us to believe that Russia and China have every right to not only use these weapons as deterrents, but to prepare for their use overall. The American belief in its own exceptionalism and European strategic parasitism, I like that term, devoid of any sense of self-preservation, is a dangerous combination. It's in such an environment that the idea of inflicting a strategic defeat on a nuclear power that is Russia in a proxy conventional war in Ukraine has been born. Russia's atomic capabilities are being ignored. The parallels that Moscow tried to draw with the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962, when Washington considered the possibility of a nuclear war with the USSR in response to the deployment of Soviet missiles in the neighborhood of the US, were rejected by Americans as far-fetched. In response, Moscow was forced to activate a deterrence factor. Under an agreement with Minsk, Russian nuclear weapons have been deployed in Belarus. Russian non-strategic nuclear forces have recently begun exercises. Nevertheless, Western countries continue to pursue escalation in the Ukraine conflict, which, if left unchecked, could lead to a military conflict between NATO and Russia and a nuclear war. This scenario can be prevented by further strengthening deterrence, more precisely by nuclear sobering up our adversaries. They must realize it is impossible to win a conventional war involving vital interests of a power armed with an atom bomb, and that any attempt to do so will lead to their own destruction. This is classic nuclear deterrence. So, this is exactly right. The big point here is that if you look at what has happened with Ukraine, the arming of Ukraine, the militarization of Ukraine, this is in fact 100%, and the same goes for what's happening in the Asia Pacific. This is exactly like the Cuban Missile Crisis, except at a much larger scale. And of course, when it came to the Cuban Missile Crisis, we know the Soviet Union was responding to the NATO's militarization of Turkey and the region surrounding the Soviet Union then. So we are seeing now that this tit for tat is much larger than before. And not only is it much larger, but it's so much more dangerous because the United States and NATO are more unhinged than even in that period. So that is the situation we are in. Deterrence, the word, has a defensive connotation, but theoretically, the strategy can also be used in an offensive sense. This can happen when one party succeeds in dealing a disarming blow to the enemy, and with its remaining forces threaten to weaken its opponent with total destruction if they strike back. More appropriate here is the Anglo-American version of deterrence, which literally means to intimidate. The French, by the way, use the term dissuasion in their concept. So, the impact of non-nuclear weapons on nuclear deterrence policy. Non-nuclear weapons certainly influence nuclear deterrence policy, and it's a fact. The U.S. has built up a huge arsenal of non-nuclear methods to achieve its goals. Not only has it not dismantled its military alliances, it has expanded them and created new networks. In the current environment, Washington is demanding more and more real commitments from these allies in the name of preserving the U.S. global system. 50 states take part in meetings to organize military aid to Kiev under the Ramstein format. The result is the idea that it is possible to defeat a nuclear power, but on condition that it does not require resorting to nuclear weapons. The only thing left to do is convince a nuclear power not to use nuclear weapons under any circumstances and allow itself to be defeated in the name of saving the whole of humanity and so on. This is extremely dangerous. It's an illusion that can and must be dispelled by an active nuclear deterrence strategy, including lowering the threshold for the use of nuclear weapons, which is currently too high. The key condition for use should be on a threat to the existence of the state, but a threat to the vital interests of the country. So it should not be the threat to the existence of a state, but the threat to the vital interests of a country. So this is very interesting, okay? Because right now it's a threat to the existence of Russia, but this author, this prominent academic is saying it should be the threat to vital interests, meaning that yes, you cannot just simply wage war on Russia and get away with it. You cannot wage a proxy war. You cannot wage any kind of war on Russia. That's how do you establish peace if these things are possible and allowable? We can say that a new phase of relations between world nuclear powers have begun, and that some of us are still psychologically in the 70s and 80s. It's a comfort zone because the two strategic nuclear parties at that time, the Soviet Union and the United States, were at a parity. But it's disappeared since the fall of the Soviet Union, and Russia became a declining power. And now, the difficult opening phase of the Ukraine conflict gave Americans hope that the fields of the country would be a grave of the Russian superpower, and they have sobered up a bit. But equal status between Moscow and Washington is out of the question for them. And so that's why there is this buildup against Russia. So, then he talks about nuclear polycentricity reflects growing multipolarity. So now you have Beijing moving toward parity with the US and Russia, India, Pakistan, DPRK, and Israel, independent players with nuclear weapons, although you can say Israel is not so much an independent player. And so you have the situation, okay? We have many countries building up nuclear weapons, and you have the United States continuing to provoke, right? This very dangerous attacks on Russia, and you have this need, okay, to go away from what Scott Ritter would argue is arms control and toward nuclear deterrence, a nuclear deterrence that is intimidating, in fact. So I'm just going to stop it there because I think the point is very clear, right? That a lot has died. Arms control, parity, this idea that, mutually assured destruction is a reality that needs to be respected. No. The United States has operated over the past several decades, and NATO too, under the assumption that it is the superpower which cannot be defeated. And no matter how big Russia and China become, no matter how influential they become, they are in fact weak, and they will not go the distance required to undermine whatever last vestiges of hegemony the United States can hold on to. And so we see this. We see this with China as well, because it's not just Vladimir Putin and Russia that are being intimidated in this way. It's China. You have Reuters talking about a really dangerous incident. These incidents are happening all the time. This one happened on June 11th, where you had the Netherlands, right, coming in with warships right off the East China Sea. And you had Chinese fighter jets having to not only surround the Dutch frigate that was entering Chinese territory, but you also had a Dutch helicopter as well that was followed, and there was a potentially unsafe situation, according to the Netherlands. But a spokesperson for China's defense ministry said that the Dutch side is falsely claiming to be carrying out a UN mission and flex its force in the sea and airspace under the jurisdiction of another country, creating tension and undermining between the two countries. So this is happening all the time, not just with Russia, but China is also a nuclear power. Here's what China had to say about this on Xinhua, its press service. It said that Jiang Xiaogang, spokesperson for the Ministry of National Defense, made comments about this, about what happened with the Dutch side, saying that Chinese military aircraft unsafely approached its helicopter over the East China Sea. The response was legitimate and justified, said Zhang, as well as professional and standardized throughout the whole process, and that the Dutch side is falsely claiming to be carrying out that UN mission and is really flexing its muscles on behalf of who? The United States, because you know that the Netherlands is a little poodle of the United States, sending F-16s to Ukraine, for example. And it's strongly dissatisfied, the Chinese are, with the Dutch side's words and deeds, which are vile in nature and has lodged stern representations against them. So the Chinese military is always on high alert and resolute to safeguard national sovereignty and maritime rights and interests. But this is happening all the time. You recently had the Indo-Pacific Command of the United States say it wants to create a hellscape. Yes, a hellscape for China in Taiwan. And how is it going to do this? Well, I'll show you. This is what they had to say, okay? Because it is absolutely just out of this world. It's not just Russia here, and I'm just going to pull this up quickly. Let me just stop that and pull this up quickly because, and here we go. All right. It says the U.S. military has a plan to turn the Taiwan Strait into an unmanned hellscape if China invades. If China invades is what they always say, but they're planning it now, and China hasn't done anything. It doesn't have any plans to militarily intervene unless the United States backs independence with military means, especially. But the U.S. has plans to employ thousands of drones if China invades Taiwan, says the U.S.'s top admiral in the Indo-Pacific Command. The unmanned hellscape would buy the U.S. time to come to the aid of Taiwan if needed. China's drills around the island last month raised questions about what a blockade or invasion would look like. And here's what he said. He said, I want to turn the Taiwan Strait into an unmanned hellscape using a number of classified capabilities, said Samuel Paparo, commander of the U.S. Indo-Pacific Command to the Washington Post. He said he can make their lives, China, utterly miserable for a month, which buys me time for the rest of everything else. The plan involves launching thousands of unmanned systems from surface vessels and submarines to aerial drones to fight Chinese invading forces as soon as they begin to cross the Taiwan Strait, acting as a kind of first line of defense. This is how unhinged these people are. This is not a plan for later. This is a plan for as soon as possible when they see the conditions are ripe. And it's so hilarious that they talk about classified capabilities when in fact, if the United States had these capabilities, why aren't they using them in Ukraine? Russia's drones are absolutely obliterating NATO weaponry, NATO arms, and of course, Ukrainian forces on the front lines. Why aren't they using these unmanned super abilities to fight Russia right now when Ukraine is on the backslide, when they are actually losing? Well, it's because I don't believe they actually have capabilities that can buy a certain amount of time. We saw how China surrounded Taiwan. How long do you think Taiwan's economy is going to last if it's militarily blockaded? How long do you think Taiwan's so-called military can last against the People's Liberation Army? I don't think very long. I don't think it's these classified capabilities are on the level, but nonetheless, the threat of it, even any level of this, means nuclear war. It's the same principle that Russia is stating here, that Russian academics, think tanks, foreign policy analysts are all talking about right now because of how Russia's red lines have been crossed. The same goes for China. This is the same warning. This is the same issue. This is going to be the same phenomenon that plays out just in a different form. So here's what Scott Ritter had to say about 90 seconds to midnight. I'm going to play his analysis on this doomsday clock issue, okay, to close here, because I think his words need to be heeded given all of his experience in arms control, in
famously
talking about nuclear weapons, and having that direct experience with what it means to be part of this nuclear armed regime that has always been, but especially now, more unhinged than ever, the United States government.
Bulletin of Atomic Scientists famously or infamously maintains what is known as the doomsday clock. Since its inception in 1947, the doomsday clock symbolically tracks how much time is left before midnight, the theoretical end of the world that will accompany a nuclear conflict. When they started in 1947, the clock was set at 7 minutes to midnight. By 1953, the clock had been reset to 2 minutes to midnight, reflecting advances in the technology of nuclear weapons, hydrogen bombs, and the Cold War that made it possible to even theoretically consider the possibility that the United States and the Soviet Union would use these horrible weapons against one another. After the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1963, the clock was set backwards because both the United States and the Soviet Union, reeling from what was almost the end of the world, realized that they had to bring stability. The concept of arms control came into play. The clock fluctuated over the years. When I started in 1984, the clock was set at, I think, around 3 minutes. By the time I finished started my arms control work in 1988, optimistically, the clock was pushed back. Why? Because we were getting rid of nuclear weapons. By 1991, the clock had been set to 17 minutes before midnight. People talked openly about the prospect of the end of the concept of nuclear Armageddon, but that was not to be. Today, the clock stands at 90 seconds. That is the closest the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists has ever set the clock to this theoretical midnight. But it is not a theoretical midnight. Today, the world faces the prospect of imminent nuclear conflict. We are closer to nuclear conflict today than we have been at any time in the nuclear era. We are in greater danger of a nuclear war than we were at the height of the Cuban Missile Crisis. Why? Because the United States has foolishly and dangerously allowed the Ukrainian government to use weapons provided by the United States to Ukraine to strike targets inside Russia. In December of 2021, before this conflict began, Russia had submitted a draft treaty to the United States and to NATO where they talked about new European security frameworks. They talked about the conditions to resolve the dispute over Ukraine peacefully without resorting to military force. One of the things that the Russians let their American counterparts know is that NATO would never be allowed to absorb Ukraine. And one of the reasons is that if NATO ever placed its long-range ballistic missiles on Ukrainian soil, that would place Russia's strategic nuclear capabilities at risk of preemptive attack. The command and control centers, early warning radars, the actual missile sites. This is why Russia has drawn a red line, famously described in a memorandum written by then U.S. Ambassador to Russia, William Burns, in 2008 as the "Niet means niet, no means no." Ukraine would never be allowed to become part of NATO. And yet today, because of the United States, because of NATO, long-range American missiles are on Ukrainian soil. And the United States has given Ukraine permission to use these missiles to strike targets in Russia, targets that include, at least potentially, nuclear command and control centers, nuclear weapons storage facilities, early warning radars, and the actual nuclear delivery systems themselves. This is an existential crisis for Russia, one which, if called upon to respond, they will do so in a way that reflects the danger of the situation that's been thrust upon them. Russia has talked about using nuclear weapons to strike targets not in Ukraine, but in Europe against NATO and potentially against the United States. 90 seconds to midnight. That's wrong. The truth is we are 1 millisecond from midnight. All it takes is one ATACMS missile being launched by Ukraine with this assistance and guidance of the United States to strike the wrong target inside Russia, and the world will end. That's where we are today. The most dangerous situation the world has faced since the Cuban Missile Crisis back in 1963.
Well, there you go, everyone. There you go. That's That's exactly, people in the comments for a while now, but even just now, we're saying, aren't we just a second? Yes, Scott Ritter made it known that we are just a second away from midnight. Why? Because all it takes is one launch, one strike by the United States, by NATO into Russian territory, where they are, in fact, not just coordinating the logistics, but actually launching those strikes from NATO territory, because those weapons are coming from there. Then Ukraine uses them. This has honestly been the case since the very beginning of the conflict. It was Russia that added, as Scott Ritter has said on this show, extra rungs to that ladder. But now, because the United States and NATO are openly, with their bluster and their arrogance, just flatly uh, uh, pushing in the faces of Russia, in the faces of really the entire world, Russia and China, saying, this is our policy and we're just going to do it. And what are you going to do about it? Well, we know where all this leads now, thanks to the analysis of Scott Ritter, thanks to those in Russia who are telling us where it leads. It leads to nuclear catastrophe, because Russia has the right to nuclear deterrence. This is not against any kind of international law. This is not against any kind of arms treaty. Those are all gone. The US has trampled on international law. The arms treaties have been ripped up by not Russia, but the United States, refusing to negotiate diplomatically at any level, bilaterally or multilaterally. This is the situation we are in. So it's a really, I think, important note to see both how Russia and China too, both Putin and Xi Jinping, how they are not going to allow this to occur without a response. They are not going to sit back and allow themselves to be defeated militarily. And that's what makes nuclear war a very real possibility, because the United States and NATO and this Western civilization, quote unquote, that is hell bent on their destruction, is going to be the one to provoke this. They are making step after step, inching closer and closer, not just to these red lines, because let's be honest, the red lines have long been crossed. What they are now entering into is a phase of utter barbarity, where it's almost as if you have the barbarians dancing nakedly in front of this multipolar world and their leaders and its leaders in Russia and China, nakedly in front of them, saying, what are you going to do about it? What are you going to do? We will smash everything that you believe in, that you want to see, that you are building, and we are daring you to do something about it. That cannot last. That will not stand. It's only because Putin, Xi Jinping, Russia, and China, we can add in Iran in there, we can add in the rest of the multipolar world, but really the two big nodes, these two developing powers, it's only because they are succeeding right now. It's only because they are defeating this empire by other means that this hasn't already happened. Let's be quite honest. Russia could have responded in a big way to what was done to Ukraine to provoke the special military operation. It could have responded in a much bigger way. It could have immediately began preparations for nuclear war. Could have immediately done that. But it waited and wanted to see what happened, wanted to see what it could do. Could it stave this off? How would it be able to respond to these sanctions? And look at what Russia has done. It has defeated the sanctions, and Ukraine is on the backslide. Ukraine is basically retreating. China could easily begin preparations for a military conflict over what's happening to Taiwan, what the United States is doing. But it's not. Why? China has no reason to undermine its own economy. It has no reason to undermine its own growing stature in the world. It's already the biggest economy in the world in purchasing power parity terms. It's alleviating poverty. It's eradicating extreme poverty. It is a world leader in so many other areas, technology, infrastructure, you name it. Why would China want to undermine that with a war? But nonetheless, if war comes to them, war is coming to the United States. War is coming to those who are supporting Taiwan separatism and undermine any kind of form of undermining Chinese sovereignty. But here we again have the problem. The problem is it's an irreconcilable contradiction. Eventually, U.S. provocations, NATO provocations are going to lead to the unthinkable. And that's why it is our job not to blame Russia and China for their restraint, mind you. Most people have this utterly just a barbaric and infantile way of thinking about Russia and China. They think they're the aggressors. They're the aggressors. Far from it. And now it is our job to stop the true aggressors, to stop the United States, to stop NATO, to stop this military apparatus in the hands of the warmongers from doing the unthinkable or from facilitating the unthinkable. Doesn't matter. It's their fault either way. It's their war that they are waging. And we have to stop it. We have to stop the genocide in Gaza. We have to stop this build up to a nuclear war with the multipolar world, with Russia, with China. That's our responsibility in the collective West, in the United States. No one else's. Everyone else is trying to defend themselves, defend their sovereignty, build a new world, despite being provoked, surrounded, threatened, despite having war being literally waged against them at their own borders. So there you have it. We are very close to midnight. It is our responsibility. And we should be thanking Russia. We should be thanking China, not just for their restraint, but everything that they are doing to build a world where the diktats of the hegemon are no longer reigning supreme worldwide. Thank you for tuning in to my latest video. I appreciate all of your support. This channel, however, needs your help. I am seeking to make this channel more sustainable in the long term and upgrade necessary equipment to ensure that this work continues onward and makes progress to give you all of the geopolitical analysis that you all deserve. For that reason, I'm asking you to become a member of my Patreon community at patreon.com/DannyDhaiphong. You can find that link in the video description or in the pinned comment below. For whatever amount you choose to give, just know you are supporting independent media that you can't find anywhere else. Thank you so much, and I look forward to the next video.